My job basically is going to be timekeeper, kind of promoter of discussion, etc. But of course, that's got to be done by you. And since the second paper is going to be coordinated contingent punishments, maybe people can inflict coordinated contingent punishments on people who exceed their time or make long speeches or whatever by appropriately booing or whatnot. Anyway, I've been listening to Francisco over the brief lunch we are having, the kind of fascinating research that he's going to tell us about. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him, and he'll talk on Darwin's revolution, natural theology to natural selection. All yours.
Thank you to both of you for the two introductions. I'm still not clear why I was invited to speak at a meeting on public goods, and much less why I was asked to speak about this subject, although I am pleased to do it, but I am pleased to be here. I have been admired of the Institute from day one since Duncan came, and as I told him once, he probably has forgotten, but I came about 2 years before, 1 year I think, before Duncan here. And when Duncan, whom I knew from committees at the academy, came here, I decided that, yes, I have come to the right place. If it's the place where Duncan Lewis was coming as well. And I have over the years attended some of your meetings and the like. So let me talk about this, about my subject then. On April 28, 1937, still in the very early stages of the Spanish Civil War, Nazi airplanes under the command of General Franco bombed the city of Guernica in the Basque Country, a small city, no military target of any kind, had 7,000 inhabitants, about 1,750 died, so 25% of the whole population were killed, children, women, and as well as men. One reason why the city was bombed, because it's considered the spiritual home of the Basques. I happen to be Basque genetically, although I was born and grew up in Madrid. And the Basques were against the coup d'etat that Franco had and gave rise to the civil war that eventually would last 3 years. Pablo Picasso had been asked by the Republican government to paint a mural for the Spanish Pavilion, for the world exhibit that was going to take place in October of that year in Paris. Hearing of the tremendous destruction, Picasso, in a fit of manic energy, outlined in 2 days this enormous painting, and actually made a full sketch, including most of the details, in another 10 days. This is about 26 feet long and nearly 12 feet high, so it's a huge painting. Well, I think that you would agree with me that this painting was painted with the idea of communicating some message. It was painted for some purpose, in this case the horrors of war and the inhumanity of man to man. And in the same way, I think you would agree with me that the watch has been designed to tell time, or a car has been designed for transportation. These are the letters of the alphabet and the digits, as you see. These are butterfly wings. So we could use these letters to write text in English, and we could use the digits to make arithmetic calculations, but I would think that most of you would agree with me that these letters, these butterfly wings, were not designed for the purpose of writing text, or the digits for making arithmetic calculations, in the same way that we would say that a mountain may be used for skiing, but we don't think that the mountain has been designed for the purpose of skiing, and we can navigate in the rivers and oceans, but they have not been designed for that purpose. Well, what about the eye? The message that I'm going to convey to you, and I don't think it's news to anybody here, is that the eye has something in common with the painting and with the watch and with the car, and something in common with the butterfly wings and the mountains and the oceans. What it has in common with the painting is that if it were not for the purpose it serves, namely vision, as the painting was for some other purpose, or the watch or the car, if it were not for the purpose it serves, it would not have come to exist. What it has in common with the butterfly wings and the mountains and the rivers is that it is a result of natural processes rather than the result of specific design by an intelligent designer, as by an individual, a person, an artist, or a mechanic or whatever, or an engineer, as it was the case in the human design objects. And we owe it to Darwin that he made this important discovery, that you could explain design without postulating a designer, which was no minor feat. There is a narrative in the history of ideas which says that there were two great revolutions in the history of science. One, the Copernican revolution, which can be dated to 1543, the year of Copernicus' death, when he published this book on the revolutions of celestial bodies. According to this narrative, the Copernican revolution consisted in removing the Earth from being the center of the universe to being one more planet. And here we have a contemporary drawing from a German book with the Earth, Terra, in all books at the time were scientific books written in Latin, and for 2 more centuries at least. So you have the Earth in the middle, and then you have Mercury, Venus, then the Sun going around, then Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the constellations of the stars. And this is a drawing by Copernicus' own hand, now with the Sun in the middle, Mercury, Venus, the Earth and the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the stars. And of course now we know that the Earth not only is just one more planet around the Sun, but the Sun is just one more star among the 100 billion or so in our galaxy, and there are about 100 billion galaxies in the universe. So the Earth was removed from being the center of the universe to being an insignificant component of it. In the same way, the narrative says that Darwin removed humans from being the center of the whole living world, as it was thought generally at the time for many centuries, and made human to be just one more species, and in fact one species that had come about in recent times. And the main book to which is credited for this revolution is The Origin of a Species by Means of Natural Selection, published in 1859. This past year we have been celebrating the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of a Species and the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth, who was born on 1809, on the same day actually as Abraham Lincoln, on 12th of February. So here you have in a model representation, humans are being closely related, having a recent common ancestor with chimps, and then somewhat more remote ancestor with gorillas. And one can go on all the way down, and we have common ancestors with bacteria and other microbes, as well as with other animals and plants. Well, I think that this narrative, which is due to some important historians of science in modern times, Bernard Cohen, for example, but also to people like Freud. Freud, of course, added the third revolution, namely his own. I think that this narrative is very unsatisfactory, not for what it says, which may very well be true, but for what it does not say, which is the most important. For me, the significance of the Copernican revolution is that it is the beginning of science in the modern sense. It's the commitment to the notion that the world is made of matter in motion, governed by natural laws that can be discovered, that are universal, that apply on Earth as well as in the heavens, and the case can be subject to test and experiment, and therefore one has to see it in connection with several of Copernicus' successors, of which I have highlighted two, Galileo and Newton, two of the most significant ones. And here we have Galileo and Newton, and simple laws like equal mass times acceleration, or the inverse square distance law of attraction between bodies, which is attraction is proportional to the product of the masses, but inversely related to the square of the distance. Now, the Copernican revolution had left out organisms, and had left out the organisms for many reasons, but a very main one that have been prevalent, at least in the Western world, for many centuries, certainly in the Christian and Judeo-Christian tradition, but even before that, among the Greeks, the notion that organisms give evidence of design, and wherever there is design, there is a designer. So wherever there is design, you could not explain it as the result of natural processes, and that was particularly well articulated in terms of biology, the biology of his time, by William Paley. William Paley was a very interesting character. He was author of several books of theology, which were, by the way, part of the canon while Darwin was a student in Cambridge in the late 1820s. And one of them, Natural Theology, which is the last book he wrote. But he was also very well known as a public speaker, as an abolitionist. He was fighting and speaking everywhere all the time for the abolition of slavery. In 1800, he became ill, and he had to give up his speaking career and decided to study biology, which had made enormous progress in the second half of the 18th century. And out of his studies came this book, which is a beautifully written book and summarizes the biology of his time very well. It has a central argument, which is repeated over and over again, which is the argument from design for the existence of God. And he uses one of his first examples, the human eye, and says the fact that there are so many parts that are all together, have to be all together in a precise arrangement for the eye to function, says, it gives convincing evidence that it is the result of a designer. Actually starts the book by saying, assume that I'm walking with a friend in a meadow, but suddenly I kick a stone, and somebody asks me, where does the stone come from? And he says, well, for all what I know, it may have been there forever. There is nothing to explain. But if a few steps later I kick a watch, and he asks me the same question, it happens to be on the ground there, the watch, obviously I cannot give the same answer. It is obvious that there is a watch there that has been made by a watchmaker, and again the argument is this integration of parts, or precisely arranged and designed to fulfill an overall purpose. It was Darwin's genius, as I have pointed out, that he was able to provide a natural explanation, a scientific explanation of design in his book on the origin of a species. All of you have heard that The Origin of a Species is a book about evolution. Well, it isn't. It's a book about natural selection. Darwin considered that a summary of a multi-volume book that he had planned already since 1842, that eventually never published, mostly he published the parts as different volumes, and hence the title, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. His big book was going to be called Natural Selection. The Origin of a Species is about natural selection. The first chapter is about artificial selection, as we would call it now. Selection as is practiced by farmers or animal breeders. And he uses the argument that if variations occur in animals and plants that we can use for our own benefit. Variations, hereditary variations that are beneficial to the organisms themselves must also occur. And if such do occur, can without those variations that are beneficial to the organisms will increase in frequency because these organisms will leave more progeny, will survive better, and that's what he calls natural selection, the multiplication, the increasing frequency of hereditary variations which are beneficial, and of course the elimination of those that are harmful. He, after the first chapter dedicated to artificial selection, the next 7 chapters are about natural selection, including one where he considers possible objections. And then at the beginning of chapter 9, he says, as it were, well, if evolution occurs by natural selection, as I have explained it, then evolution must have occurred, but must have occurred in a certain way. And he dedicates then 2 chapters to geology, or now we would say paleontology, 2 chapters to biogeography, and 1 chapter to comparative anatomy and comparative embryology. And then after these 5 chapters, in the final chapter, he goes back to natural selection and uses a sort of to wrap it up. Then, by the way, in the first edition, in 6th edition, which is the other one which is frequently seen, there is 1 extra chapter, chapter 8, which was new, which considers additional objections to natural selection that have been raised after the publication of his book. Now, it is well known that Darwin, after he graduated from Cambridge in 1831, on the 27th of December of that year, he went in a trip around the world in a ship of the British Navy, and he came about 5 years later, late in October of 1836. And during this trip, he got lots of opportunities to see evidence for evolution. Many fossils, for example, in Latin America. Also realized that the fauna in Latin America and also in the Pacific was very different from the fauna in Europe. Incidentally, I was recently, just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, in Argentina, and it is amazing how they veneer Darwin. And also I was pointed out and was taken to places where he made actually discoveries. He made actual excavations and found by himself some fossils in addition to those that were available. Evolution, with another name, because the term evolution was not used with the current meaning at the time, neither by Darwin nor by anybody else, but the descent with modification was the phrase used instead, but I will use evolution, which is shorter. Evolution was generally accepted by biologists at the time, in the middle of the 19th century. In 1809, the year of the birth of Darwin, Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, had published a book dedicated to evolution. There, a few years before The Origin of a Species, 15 years before, an Englishman, Chambers, had published a book about evolution. And in general, as I said, biologists accepted evolution, and indeed Darwin had written in 1842, this 17 years before The Origin, a 60 pages summary of what he thought will be his book about natural selection. And then in 2 years later, in 1844, wrote a 250-page book, essay, he called it, about natural selection. But natural selection was generally thought to be gradual change, as, for example, exemplified in the book by Lamarck, which is occurring gradually, where an organism becomes changed into something else, into other organism, usually more advanced, but it's changing gradually in all relevant respects. And Darwin says, no, if evolution occurs by natural selection, some parts of organism may change at some time, others may not change, or may change at different times, and the same organism may change in different ways in different places and at different times. And then, as I said, uses 5 chapters of The Origin of a Species to show that that's how evolution happens. When Darwin returns from the trip in 1836, after very nearly 5 years at sea and exploring these foreign lands, he has become totally convinced that the important issues to explain how evolution occurs, or you wish how the sign comes about. He had read Paley, he had admired Paley, and he realized that that was the problem to solve, how to explain, how science could explain adaptation, as we would call now the diversity of species, and the sign. And he writes in his notebooks that are fairly well dated, not precisely because he used to write 2 or 3 different notebooks at the same time, but we have the notebooks that he writes from 1837 and 1838, at least within the first 2 years after the return of the trip, when he's still a young man, 28 to 29 years old. We know that at some point he comes upon the idea of natural selection. He had written earlier, just about one of the first recordings, is what is the point of keep looking for evidence for evolution if we don't know how it occurs? What is important is that we find the way in which evolution occurs and the diversity of species comes about. And as I said, within the next 2 years, less than 2 years after arriving, he comes upon the idea of natural selection, and he knows he has a great idea. He knows he has made a discovery of tremendous importance, and he records this in the diaries. The diaries, by the way, have been recently published, so now we know very much of what he was recording, and he seemed to record everything that was happening in his life in all relevant respects, in very sketchy notes, but everything is there. So he comes upon the idea of natural selection, and he writes, now I have a theory to work with. And he dedicates the rest of his life to test his theory, as it were, to demonstrate the theory of natural selection is how evolution occurs, how adaptation and diversification takes place. And from there on, he refers to natural selection as my theory. He never refers to evolution or the sandwich modification as my theory. His theory is natural selection. Well, here is one of the many places he summarizes the idea, is what I have just told you a moment ago. He says, can it be thought improbable, seeing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred? He's referring to artificial selection. The variations useful to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur. And if such do occur, can we doubt that individuals having any advantage, however slight over others, would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. Since I see all of you looking very serious and intense, I have to make an observation, and it is, in case it didn't occur to you, Darwin didn't write that with a Spanish accent. That's my contribution for color.
How is that known?
Sorry?
How is that fact known?
You always ask difficult questions, let's say. One thing that had happened towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century is that geology had come of age, as it were. Two great figures are Georges Cuvier in France and Charles Lyell in Great Britain, who became a great friend of Darwin, a senior friend of his. And one thing that has been discovered is that when one sees in places where the sediments are exposed, when one sees strata like this, that these sediments became known to have been deposited mostly at the bottom of the ocean over time, and so that when fossils were found in the upper layers, they had lived more recently than fossils that were found below. And then that made it possible to reconstruct the evolution of a species, or from the changes of organisms through time. This is a modern reconstruction, but much of this was already known to Darwin. And I presume most of you know enough about biology to know that we usually evolutionists represent evolution typically from older time to more recent times in a vertical in the form of a kind of tree, where a new species, the origin of a new species is represented as a new branch. And this is a model reconstruction, and you see changes from an animal which was very small, the size of a medium-sized dog, Iracotherium, to the modern horse. And there have been many species that have existed in the past that became extinct. And this is a point that he makes again and again in the origin of a species, and particularly when he's providing the evidence from paleontology, most species become extinct. That was completely contrary to, say, what Lamarck thought, which thought that evolution was progressive, was advancing to more and more complex organisms, and that was going on. No postulate he had. Lamarck, he had no postulate of God's intervention, but he thought was a law of nature, sort of a metaphysical necessity for organisms to continuously evolve, so that if we humans had many million years ago, millions of years ago, ancestors who were worms, that the worms of today, millions of years from now, will have human beings as their descendants. Nothing of the kind, of course, for Darwin, who postulated, and of course he knew that many species had become extinct, because by Darwin's time, so many fossils have been discovered of animals and even plants that were no longer in existence. Now, one criticism that was made of Darwin in Darwin's time is, where are the intermediates, the missing links? If evolution occurs even from a kind of organism to a completely different kind of organism, as is called by the theory, where are the missing links? And no major missing links had been discovered before the origin of a species, at least none that had become known to Darwin. But within 2 years of the publication of The Origin of a Species, this creature was discovered, this fossil Archaeopteryx, which eventually Darwin incorporated in later editions, which is as intermediate between a bird and a dinosaur, between a reptile and a bird, as you can imagine, because as you can see, it had feathers. The skeleton was for the most part the skeleton of a dinosaur with a very long tail. The beak is very much like that of a bird, and so are the hind legs, although the beak still has teeth. So here you have intermediate parts, intermediate features of two very different kinds of organisms, which again is what Darwin was postulating, that would happen. There was not a change gradual, but some things will change and others might not. By the way, the last Archaeopteryx, 10th one, was described relatively recently, about 5 years ago or so, and is the best conserved one. This is the first one. It's very well conserved. So it has been bought by an American millionaire who is a guy in Wisconsin who has his private museum, mostly showing dinosaurs. But now you can go to see Archaeopteryx without having to go to Europe. These animals will live in Bavaria, what is today Bavaria, and that's where they have been discovered. Just about 5 years ago, also, this animal was discovered, Tiktaalik. Some fish were known that already had some bones and some articulation in the forelimbs, so they could move in shallow waters by walking on the bottom. And then these other two were known that are clearly reptiles. They are like crocodiles, and they have articulate limbs, very much like ours. And there were 9 million years difference in age. But what is that name? Panderictrix. It lived about 385 million years ago. Acontostega about 370 sites. So a group of scientists from the University of Chicago, some of them well known to us, decided to go to areas of northern Canada where they knew there were deposits, geological deposits of about 380 million years of age, which is the time which will be between Acontostega and Panderictis. And indeed, after several years search, they found this Tiktaalik, which starts to have the forelimbs already completely articulated, very much like we have now, which is as intermediate between a fish, some creature is still mostly a fish, and something which is definitely a reptile as you can have it. Well, the intermediates that were of more interest to most people were the intermediates between apes and humans. If we have had common ancestors with the apes, where are the creatures that were the transition from being ape-like to being humans? And none was discovered during Darwin's lifetime. He made the prediction that they would be found, and that they would be found in Africa. At least he said this in Africa, where the evolution of early humans must have taken place, contrary to what was generally thought of by his contemporaries, and for several decades afterwards, most people thought that the paleontologists, that is, that humans would have evolved in Asia. And indeed, the first hominid, as these intermediates are called, or in more recent terminology, hominins, the first hominid was this one, Homo erectus, which was actually discovered in Java, and was discovered by a Dutch doctor, a Dutch physician, who was an amateur paleontologist, and who called it Pithecanthropus erectus, Pithecanthropus, Pithe, monkey, or ape, anthropus, human. So he was a human ape, and bipedal, because he knew enough about anatomy as a physician that he was, to know that this creature, Pithecanthropus erectus, now called Homo erectus, had a bipedal gait. Well, what happened, particularly after the discovery of a fossil known as Australopithecus afarensis, and a particular individual, or bones of a particular individual called Lucy, which was discovered by two paleontologists from UC Berkeley, who were and still are great manipulators of the media. And so Lucy got tremendous attention as a discovery. And of course, it was presented to the world with all sorts of ornamentation, like they were looking at the bones at the same time, when at the end of the day, at the same time they were eating around the fire, and they were playing a song of the Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and that's why they call her Lucy. So I think there's something that we all need to learn, how to manipulate the media. Well, this had a tremendous consequence, because after the discovery of Lucy and all that publicity, the US government and many governments and many foundations decided it was worthwhile to hunt for human fossils. And there were very few known then. Now there are thousands of them, and indeed, you have different species and different genera that have lived over the years, since about 7 million years ago, which is probably when the separation of humans and chimps takes place. It's, by the way, very easy to show. I'm going to skip the slides that come next, so we will say it, that these very early hominids were already bipedal. And by looking at the bones, even to experts, for people who are not experts like we are, no, it's very easy to become convinced they were bipedal. However, they all had small brains until Homo habilis, about 2 million years ago, when suddenly the brain starts to increase from being about 300 to 400 cc to ours, which is more than 3 times larger than that. Tremendous rate of evolution. So something was happening in evolution, in the hominid evolution, that was making the brain increase in the brain, and one has to believe of intellectual powers being very advantageous to our ancestors for a triplication of a feature in size, like happens there in those 2 million years. Well, the other kind of evidence that Darwin was using was comparative anatomy. And as he was arguing, and now of course we can argue with the evolution of the hominids, here we have another case where bipedal, one of the main traits that distinguish us from our closest relatives, bipedal gait evolves first, and only several million years later, the brain, another trait that distinguishes us clearly from the apes, the brain starts to increase in size. So precisely as he predicted by natural selection. In the case of comparative anatomy, here you have the forelimbs of a whale, a human, dog, and a bird. And what this calls the attention is that these forelimbs are used for very different purposes, for writing or running or flying or swimming, and yet they are all made up of the same structure. Engineers don't use the same components organized the same way, and only slightly modified them to serve certain functions. They rather start from scratch using different materials organized in different ways to build a car, or to build an airplane, or to build a ship. The most convincing evidence for evolution has come from molecular biology. Not that we needed more evidence to prove evolution, but it's the discipline that came into existence only 100 years after the origin of a species that has the most convincing evidence, and most important, it allows us to reconstruct evolutionary history with more precision than anything else. I'm prepared to make the following claim, that you can look at any organisms that you want today, 2 or 100 or 1,000, as different as you may want them to be, from bacteria to plants to yeast plants and humans, and identify some species, and the evolutionary history of these species back to their common ancestor can be reconstructed with as much precision as you may want. We can reconstruct the evolutionary history of any living species now with as much precision and detail as we want, so long as one is willing to invest the money and other resources. Very briefly, for those of you who are not very familiar, and to honor one of our colleagues, I will show the first example of how you could use molecular biology to reconstruct evolutionary history. Cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is a very small protein, 104 amino acids long, the units that make up proteins. And it was studied at the time, we were talking about the middle 60s, precisely because being a small protein could be reconstructed. That is, one could find out by studying the cytochrome C in different species, the component amino acids, the 104 amino acids, and then to compare different species. And this is, by the way, the work of Walter Fitch, who in 1967 published a paper in Science. He, as first author, Emmanuel Margolius as the second author. Emmanuel Margolius was a biochemist who knew how to analyze proteins and get the sequence of amino acids. And Fitch enticed him to design, as it were, his studies in a way beyond the interest of Margolius for the purpose that Walter had in mind, Walter Fitch, which was to show evolution. And this is how these studies are done. So here you have human, and each one of these, in this case 3 letters, represents an amino acid. So you have the sequence of amino acids in humans that continue there. And below you have rhesus monkeys on the second row all the way down, and then a horse. And I have highlighted in color the differences. There is only one difference between humans and monkeys, and there are either 11 or 12 between humans and monkeys compared to the horse. So even if we knew nothing about the evolution of these organisms, and we knew it, of course, we would have inferred that because evolution is a gradual process, that humans and monkeys are more closely related to each other than they are to the horse. Moreover, that the difference between humans and monkeys was a change that had taken place in humans, because the horse and the monkeys is the same, threonine, and so it is for many other species. It's the humans that are different. So what Fitch was showing the world as it were at the time, and this publication had a tremendous impact. My mentor, my PhD sponsor, was somebody called Theodosius Dobzhansky, which is one of the great giants of evolutionary genetics, of evolution of the 20th century. And I was at the time, 1967, a young assistant professor at Rockefeller University. Dobzhansky was a super famous man, but his office was not far from mine, and he just went with tremendous energy, as he did everything with tremendous energy when he was excited. And he said, "Francisco, have you seen Science Today?" Well, I was under the microscope, and I don't have to tell him, he should have known that an assistant professor at 10 in the morning or 9 in the morning is working on the microscope, and only the senior professor can be sitting in his office reading science. So anyway, he said, this is going to change the way we study evolution, and indeed, it did. So the idea is you construct a matrix like this, with counting the differences, and then from there you construct a tree, human and monkeys with a recent common ancestor, a more remote ancestor with a horse, and the change having taken in the human lineage, ignore the numbers in parentheses. So they have studied 20 species from humans to fungi, and they have this matrix. Another thing that was happening at the time is the availability of computers. They were starting to be available for us scientists. You could not reconstruct by hand very likely evolutionary history of all these organisms based on this matrix, but the computer did it. And here you have it. One branch of evolution going to the yeasts, another one going to the animals, one branch going to the insects, and then to the various vertebrates. Now the relationships that came out of this tree, and this is Fitch's tree, this is not the drawing. The drawing is actually mine. I have been for the last 30 years or so author of the very long article, 35 pages or so, in the Encyclopedia Britannica about evolution. But this is, the relationships are all Fitch's relationships. There are 2 billion years of evolution from there to the present. And the notion that with one short protein you could reconstruct that very nearly accurately, not accurately, but you now, and this is where the molecular biology is so powerful, that you look at one gene or one protein, and then you can look at another one and another one and another one. All proteins, all the DNA of a single organism reflect the same evolutionary history. So you can continue studying until you get all the precision that you want. So we have now the universal tree of life, and I am going to skip that because I want to use the last few minutes to talk about natural selection proper. We already saw this, and I'm going to illustrate for you, for those who may not be quite familiar, how natural selection works. First, with one experiment, there was the kind of experiment that we were doing while I was a graduate student at Columbia University in the early 1960s. What now we call molecular biology didn't exist as a discipline or with that name, but we have something called bacteriology, where did the kind of work which was closest to what now will be called molecular biology. And this is an experiment where you take bacteria, the colon bacteria, which are, we have trillions of them in our digestive tract, and therefore if an accident happens during this experiment, there is no great danger of getting sick. And you get this E. coli, which can grow in a small test tube by just providing a solution of some source of energy, of a sugar, usually sucrose or glucose. Solution of glucose or sucrose is what these creatures need to grow. We cannot synthesize the 20 amino acids that make up our proteins. Bacteria can. We synthesize only about half, so we have to eat protein because we need to eat the other ones. We cannot synthesize them. Bacteria can synthesize everything, this bacteria in particular, all the amino acids, except that in this experiment, some bacteria were used that had a mutation that made them unable to synthesize histidine, one of the 20 amino acids. So one had to add histidine in the medium in addition to sugar. But they introduced a few bacteria in that culture, a few hundred or a few thousand, and in less than 2 days, or up to 2 days, depending on the temperature, you have 20 billion bacteria in a 10 cc culture. Then the next step in this experiment is to add a drop of streptomycin. That's what is shown here, that these bacteria are not resistant to streptomycin. They are streptomycin minus. Bacteria are not resistant to antibiotics unless they have been exposed to an antibiotic. So you introduce a drop of streptomycin and all the bacteria die. Well, not all die because mutations occur spontaneously, these hereditary variations that Darwin was speaking about. And one of the reasons why we were doing these experiments, by the way, was to get estimates of mutation rates. And the mutation in the bacteria from being sensitive to streptomycin to being resistant occurs with a frequency of 1 in 100 million. So you expect about 200 bacteria to survive, and then in a couple of days you have 20 million, all resistant to streptomycin. Then you remove histidine, you move them to a culture where there is no histidine, and the same thing happens. So you end with bacteria that are resistant to streptomycin and are able to synthesize histidine. Those two events have a probability of 4 times 10 to the minus 16. So even if you would have a huge culture, you wouldn't have one bacteria with that attribute. And here you have all the 20 billion of them having these attributes. Natural selection is a very powerful way for the selection of favorable traits. And this is an example from nature that, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip, just to look at biogeography and the evidence that comes from biogeographical studies. Darwin, as I have told you, used 2 chapters of the origin of species to use the distribution of animals and plants throughout the world as evidence for evolution. One of the best places to study evolution and evolution by natural selection are in very isolated archipelagos, and none is better for the purpose of the Hawaiian Islands, about 2,000 miles from us. And the reason why so appropriate is because evolution takes place mostly in the continents, and the archipelagos, the continents, plants and animals move in various ways, but archipelagos that are very isolated, they're very rarely colonized. And then when they get colonized, the organisms that are there find no competitors, and then they quickly diversify. And if there are multiple islands, they have isolated environments, so it's another opportunity to diversify. Another feature of the Hawaiian Islands, which I presume is known to you, is that all the islands are formed here, where the Kilauea volcano is active now. But they are sitting on the Pacific, North Pacific tectonic plate, which is moving northwesterly at the rate of 2 inches per year. So they are formed here and they are moving that way. So when volcanic eruptions are not occurring for some time, then when they start again, you have a new island, and in other cases, you have additional mountains within the same island. Well, let me show you something about the diversity of life in Hawaii. Here, I have listed a few kinds of organisms, the number of species that exist in Hawaii, and how many of them are endemic, that is existing in Hawaii and only in Hawaii. And this is it. Drosophila flies, the flies that we geneticists use in the laboratory for experiments. There are 2,000 species in the world, 25% only in Hawaii, and all of them occur only in Hawaii. Recently, others have been introduced by humans. We know where they come, again, using molecular biology. The Hawaiian Islands were colonized around 20 million years ago in what is today the Midway Atoll, which was an island formed where now is the big island of Hawaii, by some species coming from what is today Oregon. And they had other similar insects with similar ways of life, so they diversified tremendously. And you have 25% of all the species of Drosophila in the world are in Hawaii. About 4% the area of California has 25% of the world's species. Insects, very few. That number may not seem to be very small, but we know more than 750,000 species of insects So that's less than 0.5%. Moreover, there are very few kinds. You see, 15% of them are just Drosophila. And so notice, however, if you have not noticed that yet, that there are no mammals and there are not many other kinds of organisms or reptiles and the like. They never occurred in Hawaii for the reason that colonization has not been easy. Darwin didn't study the Hawaiian Islands, but he studied the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos is the Spanish word for tortoise, and the Spanish sailors who discovered the islands called them Islands of the Galapagos because they saw these huge tortoises, 300 or 400 pounds in weight as adults, existed in those islands, nowhere else, and diverse in different islands. They have diverged as a consequence of evolution, and again existed there, like the famous Darwin's finches, of which only one species exists in the west coast of South America. They have diversified tremendously, and both the Galapagos, the tortoises, and the finches were studied by Darwin. Here is the reconstruction of the evolution of the finches. Let me just finish once again by pointing out the tremendous significance of this discovery. E.O. Wilson is probably known by name and probably in person to many of you, has said recently that Darwin is the most important scientist in the history of mankind. I have been thinking that for years, but I don't dare to say it in public. But now that he says it, I can quote him. He provides the explanation of the sign. The organisms are the most complex, the most diversified, one could say the most interesting realities in the world. They have been left out by the Copernican revolution. It was Darwin's genius that allowed us to explain why fish have gills to breathe in water, and a cheetah has legs and muscles for running fast, and a bird has wings for flying. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk and pictures. We don't have a formal discussion assigned, right? So the floor is open for comments, etc.
I don't understand.
But-
I'm sorry. He's the chairman.
No, actually, it's much easier for you to.
Okay. I saw him first.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the islands of the archipelago?
Oh yes, because you see what happens is, and I skipped that explained it in Hawaii, or skip the figure in the Galapagos. What happens is they colonize an island, and in the case of Drosophila, we can trace it with molecular data to 20 million years ago in an island which is today Midway Island. Now it's only an atoll. And as they colonize different islands, they have the opportunity to evolve into different species. Again, they don't find competitors and the like. In fact, within the same island, different mountains or different valleys give rise to different species. That's why the multiplication of the species is so enormous. So here, for example, we have the reconstruction of the evolution of the finches. This is when the current islands of the Galapagos were formed, the oldest one 4.5 million years ago. Then you have the other ones to the present. And this is when the first species of finch gets to the Galapagos 3 million years ago, and each one of these represents a new species. So as you have more islands, you have more species.
Yeah, Francisco, you said that Darwin was the most important scientist. I won't disagree.
Wilson said it.
Okay. How would you assess the importance of others like Wallace and Lyell to this the synthesis? Where would you be if...
I am very heterodox with respect to historians of science, with respect to Wallace. Wallace discovered, quote unquote, natural selection independently, wrote a letter in 1858 to Darwin, 5 pages long letter, where he says, Mr. Darwin, do you think this idea deserves to be published? Please have it published. And Darwin was shocked, literally, because he saw natural selection described in this short article in 5 pages. Darwin had discovered natural selection in 37 or 38. He's working on it, and he didn't want to publish the idea until he had convincing evidence, because he knew it was a very revolutionary idea. He was changing the paradigm, as now we would say, in the minds of most people, including religious people and philosophers and the like. And suddenly finds that Wallace has discovered the idea. And then he wanted to, as an honorable man, to publish the letter from Wallace. The reason why Wallace sent it to Darwin is because he was known in the biological community that he was working on evolution and that he knew a lot about it. Wallace was collecting specimens in Indonesia, animals and plants, for the purpose of selling them to museums and other collectors in Great Britain. And he had written before several times to Darwin, and Darwin was actually encouraging him to continue this work, because at times Wallace was dispirited, particularly when a ship that was carrying many of the things that he had collected sank. And that means he got no money, because that's the way he made a living. Well, to get to the point, I don't think that Wallace discovered natural selection as a way to explain the science. If one looks, and I have it actually, the slides beyond the, thank you, I have some slides about Wallace that I will show them. If you look at the title and the article, he's talking about progress. He believed, like Lamarck, in indefinite progress, continues going on. And he thinks natural selection will be the way in which you explain progress. He's not trying to explain adaptation. It is there is a necessity for organisms to keep changing and becoming better and better, but this happens by differential reproduction, by natural selection. So he does not discover what was important, which is the explanation of the sign. Now, most historians put Wallace next to Darwin, and fair enough, but I think they are not in the same league by any stretch of imagination. Lyell was a great genius, you know. And the first volume of of Geology, of a 3-volume work of Geology written by Lyell, Darwin had just took with him for the trip. It had just been published in 1831, and the other 2 were sent to him as they were being published. They did him in what is today Buenos Aires. And Lyell was a true genius, and the advances of geology, I mean, you can identify 2 people, Lyell and Cuvier, with an important change is that both start from the same point, thinking that the different forces in different strata are separate creations. And Cuvier died that way. He never believed in evolution. He thought complete fauna has become extinct and God had created a complete new set of animals and plants. Lyell started that way and resisted evolution for a while. He eventually accepted evolution and of course became a very close friend of Darwin. Okay.
In your quote from Darwin, you had the phrase thousands of generations. So I'm wondering, how did the skeptics or the critics react to this? The amount of time it would take for most species to go through thousands of generations must have seemed to them longer than the time the Earth had existed, at the time when they didn't have the conception of
there's right. It's a frequent objection. You know, we know that life started on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. As I pointed out, you have enough generations in 2 days of bacteria to go from a few hundred to 20 billion.
Yeah, absolutely, we know that, but did people know that in 1850 or 1860?
Well, I was going to it. Darwin knows, precisely because of the work of Lyell and to a certain extent Cuvier, that many of these, the organisms that lived at the time had been in existence for millions of years. And he cites, for example, some of them. One, Nautilus, an open ocean snail, which still exists nowadays, where he uses an example of an organism that has not changed at all over millions of years. And he says, why would it change? It lives in the middle of the ocean. That ocean has not changed very much. And he uses other examples, but he speaks of millions of years. Now, famously, Lord Kelvin, Thomson argued that the Earth could not be more than a few 100 million years ago. And Darwin thought that was a little bit too short, but he thought that a few 100 million years ago might be enough. As you know now, we know that he was wrong, or Kelvin, by one order of magnitude at least with respect to the age of the Earth. But you know, you can have many billions and billions and billions of generations in a few million years.
Could you say something about Darwin, the issue of cooperation within the species and among species and public goods?
Yeah, I'm glad that you are canceling the rest of the speakers. I could say much, but let me say what I could say in a few words that is interesting. You know, he published in 1871 The Descent of Man.
Right.
And that, again, that book has not been credited enough. I think he gets it all right, including in one lecture that I often give to philosophers, The Origin of Morality. I think he got it right. All the philosophers and scientists since have gotten it wrong. But he, one of the things that he says with respect to cooperation is that we can envision that a group of organisms where, in humans, he's talking about humans, not organisms in this example, where the members of the tribe will all work to the benefit of each other, that tribe will benefit, it will expand, and of course people who are contrarians might be eliminated by ignoring, or you have a tribe mostly made of contrarian people. There was no prosperity, and he actually makes cooperation the foundations of the norms of morality, which I think is not what you are thinking of. You probably think more of economics, but
that's fine.
Yeah. But anyway, he has quite a bit of writing, a full chapter 3 of The Descent of Man, and many other passages elsewhere about cooperation among humans, and speaks concretely about tribes that he had visited, others that he knew from the literature, and looking for evidence of cooperation.